Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Traister. Thank you so much for being here. Tonight's topic is very roughly radical women's movements. And I want to start, though we have an artist and two historians here. I'm a journalist who writes both about the present and the past. I want to start in the moment that we're in right now, which is a moment in which there is a lot of activism brewing from a lot of different directions. And I suspect that a lot of people who are here for this conversation tonight are here because you're engaged in that activism or want to be or are interested in it. And so the question I wanted to open with is that whether the activism is coming in reaction to the fact that we elected an openly racist, xenophobic, self-confessed sexual predator, or whether it's in reaction to the fact that a remarkably qualified woman who was the first nominated by a major party lost to that man, or whether it was because, whether you're invested in that activism because you saw an opportunity to elect a democratic socialist, calling the left to revolution, and he's not the president either. We are now where we are, and I want to ask first, starting with Brittney, and then going to Paola, and then to Linda, what is the potential in this moment where there's obviously so much Supreme Court, environmental justice, reproductive justice, there's so much bad. Yeah. What is the potential in this movement for activism?
Sure. So I think that the potential is that the only way we're going to shut shit down is for people to get in the streets and shut shit down. And it's really important to say that I don't actually root this moment of feminist activism in the election of him. I root it in the reemergence of, or the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's very interesting that folks want to start talking about feminism on January 21st, not recognizing that we had a social movement that was shutting shit down all over the country for 2 years, more than 1,000 days of protest. More than 1,000 protests, often hundreds of days at a time, by women who were clearly self-identified Black feminist women who put feminist thinking at the forefront of how they were talking about racial justice issues. And so they created the energy that said now is the time to get in the streets. That's why people knew on January 21st to take to the streets, because we had been watching people take to the streets for 2 years, challenging and forcing their concerns onto the agenda. And so it's really important not to erase that critical, not just activist labor, but thought work and intellectual work around activism that was happening then too.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. And I think, so I was one of the national organizers for the Women's March, as well as the artistic director of the march. So, and one of the things that was very important for everyone at the Women's March, particularly the 4 co-chairs, was this idea of legacy and the importance of, our headquarters in New York City were based out of Mr. Harry Belafonte's offices. So that legacy was present with us every day. I would literally look up at pictures of Mr. Belafonte with Dr. Martin Luther King, with Malcolm X, with Muhammad Ali. Like, we were surrounded with Diane Nash. We were surrounded by all of these legends that we knew that we were standing on their shoulders, and obviously also Black Lives Matter. And we worked very closely with Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors to talk to them, to see what we were doing. And when we put out our unity principles, it was this idea that we, the Women's March, who was just this conglomeration of 25 women, were not presenting any sort of solution. We had 30 women, mostly women, all women actually, that put together that policy document together. We worked on that for 3 weeks, where everyone who had their issue that they were passionate about and they were experts in were presenting the world as they saw it. And then we all were able to work in that way. And it was a very, everyone in that space said that they had never worked in that way. They had never been given the freedom, the trust to be able to just put up their thoughts on a Google document and trust that it was going to come out. And I think that that was this idea of collective belief in something that was larger than us and recognizing what had come before us. And I think to the question of what is the potential for now? For me, the potential for now is that we are organizing. I like to believe that we are organizing out of love. And when we're organizing out of love, because everyone is always talking about, are you going to get tired? Is the resistance going to get tired? How are you going to maintain for 4 years? How are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? If we're organizing from a place, I believe, from injustice and anger, of course we will get tired. But if we are organizing out of a place of love, I will never be tired of loving my son. I will never be tired of, I've been in a relationship for 17 years, and yes, I've been tired in loving that relationship, but I keep at it because I believe in it, and I want to be there, and it's because it's love. So to me, the potential for us in this moment is to truly understand the power of love. I got myself up from being knocked down on the ground on November 9th because I loved my community. Because that was the only thing that I could do that day, was to help. Because my community, which is the undocumented community, which is immigrants, was severely under attack. And the calls that I was getting of fear and desperation and not knowing what to do was what motivated me into action. And so I know that power of love, and that is what gives me the idea of potential in this moment.
Being the historian, one of the first things I want to say is to do a little history background to what Brittney said that I couldn't agree with more, and that is that in this country, every time there has been a women's movement, it has come out of a Black struggle.
Yep.
The first wave feminism came from the movement against slavery. Second wave feminism came from the civil rights movement. So I think that's very important today. There is something a little bit different about Black Lives Matter that I think we all know, but I just want to underline it, and that is the importance of women's leadership within it, and also of queer leadership within it. This is new. This is not quote unquote traditional. I think there's a lot of potential here, and there is a growth of movements among that generation that involve, like the Dreamers, like the Fight for 15, and I'm sort of seeing the possibilities of coalition politics. But I do want to mention one little danger. I may wander off this. I've been getting a lot of things on my email, or even hearing people say that bringing back this old attack on what's called identity politics. And identity politics, to me, has always been a code word for movements of Black people, movements of Latinas, movements of women, etc. And the argument that somehow this quote unquote identity politics goes against the possibility of creating a larger and more inclusive movement. I think the potential involves rejecting that idea that you have to choose between an inclusive movement and between representing the particular needs and grievances of people who are particularly disadvantaged and oppressed.
Linda, you lead me to my next question, the follow-up, which, or what are the perils of this particular moment? And I think that Brittney's pointing to Black lives as the entry point into the kind of activism that's now being recognized gets us to one of the perils that I'm most worried about, and Linda's reminder that this has happened again and again throughout history, which is that in advance of the Women's March, I heard from, and in fact, in years writing about feminist politics, I have heard again and again that the days of big public demonstrations are over, right? That, oh no, the march is never gonna work because that's not how people organize anymore. We organize via social media. The idea somehow that organizing via social media was incompatible with or would, prevent the success of in-person mass gatherings was pervasive. And it was literally pervasive in the same days and years that Black Lives Matter was entirely changing the national conversation about criminal justice reform. And yet it seemed to remain obviously not invisible because it was being written about, but somehow the connection between the idea that we were seeing a mass protest movement change our politics and our activism couldn't be translated. There was no seeming application. And one of the things that was fascinating and worrying to me about the Women's March was the way that race was covered when it came to the Women's March. So that in fact, the leadership of the Women's March was led by women of color. And yet there, the resentments, the racial resentments within those, coming from those who were marching, were often presented as the lead story without any of the credit being offered either to the organizers, to the participants, to the people who drafted the statements, or to the history that had just recently preceded it in terms of Black Lives Matter. And so that's one of the points of fissure that I do get worried about. Do you guys have other things, or want to amplify or correct me in terms of how these dynamics can be perilous?
What your comment points to for me is that I tend to think that we got the president that we got as a reaction to Black Lives Matter.
Right.
And that matters in this moment because if we have a mass mobilization of women, there's no reason to believe that the establishment will shift. It might also double down. It might also become increasingly conservative and fascist before it gives. And the way we know that is because we can look at, one, how long the first wave of the feminist movement took, right? White women started organizing for the right to vote in the 1840s. That doesn't come about till 1920. And so part of what's happening too is that because what social media has done is make us think that everything speeds up in terms of time. And I very much believe that one of the things that's happening among conservatives is a desire to slow down the march of time. They want to slow it all down. It's happening too fast. All of you are wanting things too quickly, too much. This is always the move, right? Is the attempt to slow down what was seen as happening far more rapidly. And so that's why you get take us back to an old moment, right? It's literally an attempt to slow down time. I gave this TED Talk some months ago where I talked about social progress being this push and pull between marginalized groups who are always asking for their rights and demanding them now, and white people in particular who are always like, well, we don't want to give them to you this quickly. We want to slow down. We want to control time. We want to own time. We want to control when and how quickly we let people in. So I think that we should think about that psychology, right, as a particular peril about wanting to slow things down. But another peril that I see that I also think is really important, I think that part of the problem in 2016 was that even on the left, we got too woke for our own good. And so it was like me hanging out with young people who would be like, well, there's really no difference between Clinton and Trump. There's really no appreciable difference. And some of them still say this, right? Whether they're Bernie supporters or they're young Black activists who are simply disillusioned with the way that Clinton represented the establishment. And the reason why I think that's perilous is, one, because I think evangelizers in any movement are a danger. And I think that we have to figure out the balance between getting really clear about what the stakes are and at the same time being deeply committed to nuance around that. And unfortunately, sometimes you sacrifice the one for the other. You get caught in the weeds, or you see the big picture really clearly. Oh, they're all part of the establishment. It's all messed up. But you don't then see what the incremental steps might look like to get you to the things that you want. And the other thing that I worry about with regard to that is, if we have the left collapsing distinctions, we're really mad when we see it on the right, right? We're really mad when we see the right say that, like, Black Lives Matter is a hate group because they're pro-Black, right? And they don't see any appreciable difference between the KKK and Black Lives Matter. That's an inability to make distinctions that count, or a refusal to make those distinctions, which is probably more likely. But it's also true that we do that on the left, and it's dangerous. It's always dangerous. And so we can't have sanctimony on the left when we're also not making distinctions because we're mad that our person that we wanted didn't win. It didn't serve anyone well. And so I'm really trying to pursue a certain kind of thoughtfulness because I see us falling to the same habits of thought and argumentation that we see on the right, and I think that they're really dangerous.
You are brilliant. That's all I have to say. I want to be in your class, please, because I got a lot to learn. So I think, yes, all of that, absolutely 100%. I think what keeps me up at night Again, the same thing that motivated me to find another day is the same thing that keeps me up at night, which is my community, my Latino community. So for me, a major peril or a potential problem that I see is how we were unable to activate the Latino community for this election and how we might fail to do that again. So the numbers that I have found in my own personal research, there were about 25 million eligible Latino voters. We had about 11 million voters that voted. And so this is under a time frame when my community was the most attacked. We were the most vilified, or one of the most vilified. He won the election on the hate of immigrants, on the hate of undocumented immigrants. And yet, when our communities were under such attack, we had such large numbers that didn't go out and vote. And so to me, that is astounding and shocking and painful that my community wasn't able to be mobilized. And yet, my question then becomes, how did we fail? How did the establishment fail? How did I as an individual fail? And yet we cannot afford to fail again, because we are seeing the undocumented community being ripped to shreds. We're seeing families and mothers and fathers being stolen from their children, and we can't, my community cannot survive another 4 years of this man. So the question is what can the establishment, the left, the centers, the religious community, all of it, what can we do in order to get, I mean, we lost the election by 70,000 votes, right? So if my community would have voted in the right states at the right time, we would be in a different place. So that is a peril for me, is that will we be too broken? Will we be too scared? Will we not see the differences in voting for a Hillary and a Donald Trump? Because the one thing that I'd like to take heart in is the idea that I want to believe that no one now can say there is no difference between voting for a Democrat and a Republican. We see a vast difference. And so that complacency, I want that to be taken away, but I have a fear that it might not. So that's what keeps me up.
I want to respond really quickly, and it's probably bad form for the moderator to weigh in on her own question, but
not when the moderator's you.
I'm gonna. So okay. But your answer points to one of my anxieties about the perils, and I am trying to look, and maybe Linda and Brittney can speak about this in terms of historical models, in thinking about activism coming from the bottom up, from the most vulnerable people. I know the history that to some degree that is how we get the activism, but I'm so hyper aware of the way that minority rule works to suppress the power of the majority, and that one of the big costs, if you saw no difference between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, A, you were wrong, but B, you, like the Supreme Court, right? So that the very tools that can kill the means of empowerment are in the hands of the minority, so that voting suppression, voting suppression, deportations, the sort of not only the failure to move forward on criminal justice reform, but to double down on more punishing criminal justice. I mean, look, it's Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions is in charge of our criminal justice system. And what that does is disempower, disenfranchise, and make poorer the very communities and take away reproductive justice. Look at the state bans that are passing everywhere. And the Supreme Court really is, I mean, there's been a long time in my life writing about reproductive rights activism where everybody said Roe's not going to be overturned. No, for real, it could be. Yeah. Like not that far down the road. That is a real possibility. And when it is, there is also a possibility that it's not just, go back to the states, everybody says, oh, they'll still be. No, because if then there's legislative bans passed and you don't have Roe to protect it. I mean, these are systems, removing reproductive autonomy, removing voting rights, deporting, enhancing a criminal justice system that disproportionately punishes and disempowers communities of color and poor communities. These are the tools by which the minority retains its power. And so I get very anxious, I get very excited about the activism, and I'm like, but in the face of throwing people off the rolls and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act that happened thanks to a Supreme Court, what can we do? And that is I know I'm not supposed to think that because then it feels Sisyphean, but I do. That's one of my anxieties. Linda, help me.
Your statement illustrates one of my anxieties, and that is there are so many different issues. There are so many terrible things that are happening, the environment, the economy, reproduction rights, and so on. And we can't expect people to focus on all of them because we're human, we have lives, we get tired, especially when you're my age. But I want to just riff a little bit on the word thoughtfulness because I think it's extremely important. And it involves trying to guard against a kind of smugness and self-satisfaction that we get from just mouthing the right lines. One of the things I really regret has been the tendency of a lot of liberals and some feminists and leftists to characterize Trump supporters as stupid, hicks. This is exactly what people used to say to write off the Ku Klux Klan in those days, even when it was powered. And it's not true. It is not true that these people are stupid. It is not true that they are uneducated, etc. So that's part of the smugness. But then I also think that even though I want to defend what they want to call identity politics, I worry about the balance. And I'm going to say something that may anger some people, and I do want to say that I am totally in favor of the importance of recognizing queerness in sexually and in gender terms all over. But it really struck me that it was when the issue about bathrooms came up in North Carolina that we started to get a lot of corporations saying they were going to boycott. But North Carolina had disfranchised hundreds of thousands of people, and there wasn't there wasn't a sound from those corporations. Now, I don't want to trivialize the bathroom issue, but I do think, and it comes from what Rebecca just said, that voter suppression is a disaster for every one of these issues.
But Linda, do we have to choose, right? I'm really resistant to the idea that we can't stand up for bathrooms and say corporations should care about disfranchisement. I hear you on the point of we should ask the question about why corporations thought it was more socially palatable to care about bathrooms and to care about disfranchisement, but we already know the answer to that, right? Which is that no one cares about racism. Not structurally. They don't actually care about it. And that's a really hard truth to tell because one of the truths we want to run away from in this election is the deep investment that white people have in the continuation of white supremacy. Now, look, I've been Black for 36 years. And I think that there are lots of different ways that we can tell that truth that don't involve having to vilify individual people. Like one of the things, so this is a thing that's been happening as I've been moving around since January. Talking to homegirls, both close homegirls and sort of distant homegirls, who are all like, I'm not sleeping. I haven't been sleeping. Just everybody's talking about how they have anxiety. I have personally not been sleeping. And I know that many of my friends just haven't been sleeping because, white boys are out here breaking shit just for fun. That's what's happening, right? But the thing that it made me think about is I was like, oh, maybe this is what white people meant when they said that they just didn't trust Obama. I was like, maybe white people didn't sleep during the Obama years. Now, I don't care about that. I really don't. I have no empathy at all, but it was useful as a way to think about that when you feel like you are being crushed and moved out of a system where you felt like you had a place and you felt like you had footing. I'm always trying to understand people's deep emotional investments. And so I do think it's appropriate to say that I think white people had a lot of anxiety in the Obama years, even liberal white people. Because it's one thing to say you want something ideal, in theory. It's another thing to have to live with what it actually looks like. I think they didn't sleep. And I think that they probably have started sleeping again. I don't talk to enough white people every day to know that. I'm not going to start either. But But I do think that we should think about the sort of emotional investments that we have. So that's just a way that we might get into the conversation around why it continues, that it doesn't matter how many, because the thing that's interesting to me about this moment is it doesn't matter how many facts we spew at people on the right. They still believe that power is being taken. And so the thing that I think about, Rebecca, when I think about all of the sort of Supreme Court, all of these things, the word that comes to mind is apartheid. Right. Apartheid is a real system where those who are the minority rule those who are the majority. White people will be the minority in this country in another decade or so, just thereabouts, right? But they are setting up a system where they will have rule for many more decades after they no longer are the majority of the population. And so we should have an analysis that helps us to get at that. But two more things. One, I'm a big proponent of identity politics because I always want to give credit to the women who invented the term. Black women invented the term identity politics. That term first appears in 1977 with the Combahee River Collective, and they said, because we believe we're the only people who will fight for our liberation is us. And so when people, and so I was with some members of the Combahee River Collective just this weekend, and one of the things one of them said is, by that we meant that we understand that identities are political. They are political already. Not that we should be beholden always to identity in our organizing, but that we should always understand the political ramifications of the identities we have, which is, I think, a really important clarification. But the last thing I wanted to say is that, Paolo, I think with the getting tired thing, I do feel tired. But I think that what we have done in this moment, which is really amazing, is we've said that we can have many leaders. So unlike prior movements where there was like 5 people that you knew, now one of the things we said in Black Lives Matter is that we're a leaderful movement and you can't kill us all, right? And so that's taking account of the stakes, but it's also saying that we don't all have to fight every issue every day, and we're trying to build a movement where everyone feels like they have a stake. If you're teaching your students how to read and have a critique and be thoughtful, you're part of the revolution. That's what it can look like on the ground, and so it doesn't look like just a few people who have to do all of the work. So I hope that's a model that we'll pursue, is making more people feel like they have a stake and like there's something for them to lead, so that sometimes I can just be on my couch binge watching things.
You definitely should. You definitely should. And I'm not saying that I don't get tired and that we don't get tired. We obviously do. But what I am saying is that even in my most tired moments at 3, 4 in the morning, my son has been up for hours, like there is still that love there, and I will do what I need to do. And I guess that's the hope that I want for people to be able to see our country and love it in that way. And I say that with caution. I came to this country when I was 3 years old. I lived in Los Angeles. I was homeless with my mother. I was on welfare with my mother. My mother was able to go to college. Her first job was at a fast food restaurant where she learned English by a woman that was Italian that didn't speak English. She would bring home hamburgers and French fries every night for dinner because that's what they gave her for lunch for free. And she would bring that home to my brother and myself. And yet my mother was able to make amazing things happen. And both my brother and I graduated from colleges, both have master's degrees, and it's all thanks to my mother and the sacrifice and the idea of this American dream that existed complicatedly, if that's even a word, for me. But yet, it wasn't until Donald Trump was elected president that I could actually say that I loved this country. And it still gets me emotional to say that because I never really felt truly part of this country. So I became a citizen in 2008, even though I had lived in this country since I was 3 years old. I became a citizen in 2008 to vote for Barack Obama, and that was a big deal. The first time that I waved an American flag was at Obama's inauguration. And that was because, and that was for like 30 seconds, and then I was like, okay, that's enough. Because it's complicated and it's complex, and yet when Donald Trump became president, I realized that I did love this country because the country that I was living in was being taken away from me. And I was guilty of that thing that happens so much in relationships when the person that you love is no longer there. You're like, oh, but I want you and you were so great and all of these things. And that was what was happening for this country, for my country. And so for me to say that I love this country the way that I want to love my child it's a big personal jump and leap and something that I am now getting comfortable with. And so it doesn't mean that I don't get tired. And it doesn't mean that we don't get tired. I love what you all say at Black Lives Matter about a leaderful movement, and something that we've been saying as well is that this is not a sprint. It's not necessarily only a marathon, but it is a relay race, right? Someone else said that, not me. And so like we can hand off the baton when we are tired and we can go binge watch, but the love is still there and we're still engaged is what I'm trying to say. And then I think one other thing, just to riff on something that you were saying as well, is this idea that we can't spew facts to the right. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. But, and I say this with the most respect and love in my heart, because we are at the public theater, that I have come to this theater since I moved to New York City. I've had the most amazing theatrical experiences here. I've cried in this theater several times. I've seen great actors perform. I've been changed and transformed in this theater with art. And so while facts cannot change the right, or even change the people that are the moderates, or the people that went Obama, Trump, that we didn't think could ever exist, but they existed, I believe firmly with my heart that art can. That art can get into those nooks and crevices in people's hearts and begin to change and begin to question, and we can see how art can change culture. And when we change culture, that's when we can get effective change, right? And so we can go back to Will and Grace as an obvious example, that Will and Grace was a gay man brought into Americans' televisions, and whether it was stereotypical or not stereotypical, or we can critique it all we want, but it was the time when Americans were able to see a gay man as a human being. Be like, oh, that's like my Uncle Ricky, and oh, that's like my Auntie Pamela, or whatever, and oh, maybe that's like why the guy that's across the street that I never talked to, maybe he's like that, and he's not so bad. He's actually a real person. We fast forward 25 years later, and in that, with a lot of movement work and a lot of other things and a lot of cultural work, we are able to get to equal love for everybody, right? So we're able to have marriage equality. So those are, and that's it. There's a lot more in that, but I'm just saying that is what art can do, and that's where our cultural and art institutions, and why our artists matter so much during these times, to empower, to support, to tell those stories that are hard to listen to when they're just facts, but when they're humanized and universal, can really change hearts.
I want to differ slightly with two things you said. I really hear you, and the emotion in your loving America. But American nationalism is really dangerous, and a lot of people don't recognize it. We think of the dangers that nationalism did in the former Yugoslavia or in the Africa, where there's been these genocides and so on. But this talk about America great, make America great, actually has a very strong meaning for a lot of Trump supporters, and it is an extremely dangerous meaning, because it is just another form of racism. It's racism against other cultures, other people. You don't have to be an African American to experience that racism. And so I do think that there is some value that we have to uphold, that America is a part of a world, and that everyone in that world, and every country in that world, deserves respect. But there's one other thing I want to do, which is to get back to the issue of women. I said before that one of the things that, and I think we all agree about that, one of the things that's making us feel better is the rise of female leadership, which isn't easy, because there's a lot of resistance to that. But one of the signs of it is the issue about abortion that we haven't really talked about, that I think we need to really think about carefully. When abortion first was made illegal in this country, and a lot of people probably don't know that it used to be legal until sometimes between the 1840s and the 1890s. But when they were campaigning to prohibit abortion, and furthermore, at that point, all the laws prohibited all forms of birth control. And they said bluntly why that was important. Because if you have birth control, women are going to get able to do all kinds of things. They're going to want to get educated. They're going to want to go in politics, etc. I believe very strongly. I believe very strongly that when the anti-abortion movement arose again, starting in the late 1960s and into the 70s, those people, and this was a movement that was engineered with a lot of money and a lot of input, not just from the Catholic Church, but from Republican Party strategists. They knew that to argue against abortion on the grounds that that women should be confined was a non-starter. That there would be no traction. That is no longer politically acceptable. The most brilliant thing that the anti-abortion movement has done is to come up with the right to life slogan and the emphasis on the fetus. And I frankly believe that, I know some of the people believe that very genuinely. I don't disrespect them, but I think that ultimately that was a completely opportunist, manipulative move. And it underlines the point both about things I'm worried about, but also the things that are positive, which is I do believe that on average, the degree to which women are more empowered to move into politics and to lead is going to be good for this country. And it's tremendously important that we understand that. And again, I just one final caveat. One of the reasons I never supported the group called Emily's List is that they would only support women. And there were often male candidates who I actually thought were better than the female candidates. I thought that was too, so I'm not arguing for that kind of thing, but I do think that we need to think that it is mobilization of people in all kinds of ways, demonstrating, resisting, and so on, that is our only hope. And that we need to see and encourage and push many, many women into this. One of the most encouraging things I heard since then was that apparently at the local and state level, there was a big uptick in the number of women who said they wanted to run for office. And I think that in itself, it's not a panacea, but it is encouraging.
I want to respond very briefly to what you just said. Yes, it's 10,000 women have been reported by Emily's List to have expressed interest in running at state and local levels.
And it was 400 like the year before or something.
Yes, it's a massive uptick. And all kinds of Emily's List hasn't traditionally done candidate training. It's been more about funding. And I do want to push back slightly. Emily's List is an imperfect organization, and they often have endorsed candidates, in part on gender, where I would prefer the male candidate who I think is better on certain issues. And I think that's fair enough. But I will also say that Emily's List, I'm perfectly happy to disagree with it on certain races and yet acknowledge that it has fundamentally changed the possibility of representational politics, precisely because what it has done is get at funding, right? Which is one of the structural keys that has kept women and especially women of color out of representational politics. And I am struck, I write about women in politics as a journalist all the time, and I am regularly struck by the degree to which we do not want to acknowledge that we live in a country that promises that it's a representational democracy in which half the population is not represented, certainly in the executive branch, in which it's only 20% of the federal legislative branch, only slightly more than that on state and local levels, in which until November we had only ever had one black woman serve in the Senate, one black woman in the history of the United States until November when Kamala Harris was elected, and two women of color prior to November when we elected two more women of color in addition to Kamala Harris. We are so far from anywhere near fulfilling the promise that we are a representational democracy. And an organization like Emily's List, which exploded, which was founded in the 80s when women were 4% of Congress, and exploded in the wake of the Anita Hill hearings, because women were so angry, women and men were so angry and wanted to see more women up there instead of the all-white male judiciary panel led by Joe Biden that grilled Anita Hill and did not permit Angela Wright to testify. They wanted to see, not that I have really clear recall of that or anything, Joe Biden. Emily's List at that point was the organization that was raising money to fund female Democratic pro-choice candidates, and it was a place to put money. And that was where Emily's List took off. And I think that while I agree with you that I often quibble with I think there has to be a focus on upping representation based on gender if we want to get anywhere closer to representative politics. So that was my rant. But speaking to Paola's point about art, I also did want to, and I also thought when you were talking, Brittney, about not sleeping, I wanted to assure you that as a white woman, I was going to joke, like, I have not slept through the night in 175 days. But then
Stay woke.
Right. But in fact, I realized that it had been longer than that because I stopped sleeping this summer. And in fact, I mean, really, I stopped drinking. I'm a drink wine every night of my adult life, including through second and third trimesters of pregnancy. I drank wine, small glasses. But like I drink wine. I had to stop drinking wine this summer because I was so scared and angry that if I had a glass of wine at night, I would wake up at 2 a.m. and not go back to sleep until 5. And so for the first time in my adulthood, I had to stop drinking wine with dinner because I couldn't sleep because I was so scared and angry. And I want that, and I know I'm not alone. And I know many people's not sleeping predates mine. But for me, one of the great challenges of the past 6 months, the past year, has been figuring out where to put that, how to channel that fear and that anger, because I can write angry journalism, but it doesn't totally do it. I'm working on a book right now about women and anger in politics, and in part it stems from that, wanting to try to make sense of these visceral reactions I'm having. So I wanted to ask you all, in terms of art, scholarship, activism, what are you doing in this moment, either to channel your own reactions or to move the activism forward?
It occurred to me this weekend, the organization based here in Brooklyn, the Black Women's Blueprint and Spelman College came together to have this Words of Fire conference to celebrate this Black feminist anthology that really changed the game in 1995. And there are all these amazing Black feminist women there. And we were there on the 100th day of the Trump presidency. And I realized, I said, on day one, inauguration day, I threw a brunch and I invited 2 homegirls and we didn't watch the TV and we just talked to each other. And on day 2, when all the white girls were marching, I went to Brooklyn and I had brunch with some Black folks and we talked about how we felt about white girls and what we were going to do because we're feminists, right? And so I was feeling conflicted because I was like, well, I get out in the street for all these Black boys and they don't ride for us either. And so can I go out in the streets with white girls? And so I was trying to work through that politically. But I also was deeply afraid. And I said, well, I'm going to go be with some Black folks that do really good work. And then on day 100, I was in community with all of these amazing Black feminist scholars who are the reason why I do the work that I do. And so it occurred to me that is how I'm getting through it, is that I'm not particularly a people person all like that unless I like you. But I'm really trying to have more FaceTime with the people who remind me that it's possible and who remind me of what we fight for, but it's also intergenerational space because the other thing to remember is this is real scary. I don't actually think that this is like Nixon. I don't think this is like Reagan. I think this is some 19th century Reconstruction era destructive stuff. But I also remember that I'm a historian. To the extent that I'm a historian, I work in interdisciplines, but I have a book coming out later this month that's about the long history of Black women's activism and intellectual work beginning in the late 19th century. And so I write about Black women who literally picked up the pieces after Reconstruction. That's how they started their work. And what they did was say, well, what do our people need? All right, well, let's build it. They need schools, let's build it. They need hospitals, let's build it. Our kids need kindergartens. We need libraries. We need sanitariums. Let's build it. And so they got together in these conferences. Now, they also got together and dressed real pretty and took photos and stunted with each other, which was great. But they built the world that they needed in the midst of a world that was literally come to kill them. So I'm reminded that, particularly as a Black person, I'm not the first generation of Black people to experience utter devastation and make it. That doesn't make the utter devastation any less frightening, but I just keep telling myself I come from really good stock. These are my ancestors. This is the thing that they saw. I think about my grandmother who said to me in one of my final conversations with her, she said, I only wanted 2 children, but you couldn't get birth control. So I had 6. I felt some type of way because my mama is number 6. And I didn't know I was like, what are you trying to say? But that was my grandmother who, was born in 1927 in rural Louisiana and couldn't finish school. That was her feminist testament to me. And she said, I would never get married again because I would never want a man to tell me what to do with my groceries. Right? Tell me which groceries I could buy. But it mattered to me because she didn't have the language of feminism, but she had a real clear structural analysis of patriarchy and how it showed up in her life and how having children that she didn't want to have conscripted her life choices, right? And so I'm also reminded that that's the stock that I come from, people who have an analysis even when they don't have the language and who are really clear about what the stakes are. And so it's not helping me sleep, but I am hopeful because, the other thing too is like, you don't have to be, I'm a church girl just because I grew up in the Deep South and that tends to happen there. But it's also become really important to me, faith in this moment, and not just faith in a God, but faith in people, right? And so I do have, like the benefit of having had a lifetime of faith is that faith is the thing that keeps you when everything you see, there's literally no possible way you think, how can we get out of this? There is no possible way that we can get out of this. And that is when faith comes in. And so what I think is, but our people got out of slavery, and it didn't look like until the end of 1865 that they would, right? It didn't look like that was possible, and then it happened, right? It didn't look like we would ever recognize gay people having the right to build lives in whatever way they choose in this country, and it happened. And so there's something about America that is both deeply insidious and destructive and terrible, and also something that every time you're like, we're gonna break up for real this time, it comes back and like brings you flowers, and you'll be like, okay, let me try again, right? It's an abusive relationship, but nonetheless. So I think too that I'm still deeply hopeful and I have a deep and abiding faith in the power of the people to make the world what they want it to be, because I come from people who specialize in making something out of nothing. And I think but that's the book that I'm writing now is really about I think that white people in America has to think about the magic that Black folks, Indigenous folks, and Latino folks bring to the table. Because if they'll get on board with that, what it will teach them is that people come here with nothing and they make something. And so that's what we have to do. They're literally taking away everything that we have, everything that we fought for, but that's never the end of the story. And so that's the thing that keeps me going.
And I think, thanks.
Yeah, you got it.
I think also with that idea of it not being the end of the story, I myself, so pre-November 8th, I'm a filmmaker, a writer, and a director, and I do both documentaries and fiction. So most of my work for the past 8 years was and is within the undocumented community, within the immigrant rights work. And so that was my activism work, was my art, and trying to get into people's hearts by showing the humanity of the stories that I was trying to tell. After November 8th, November 9th, I spent 2 days, November 9th and November 10th, calling every artist friend that I knew and had in my phone book, whether we were acquaintances or best friends, to talk about the role of art today. And we didn't have lots of answers, we just had a lot of questions, but they were in-depth conversations that some lasted for 2 hours with like the most brilliant minds of what are we gonna do, what does art mean, how does it function, what are we gonna do now, what's the long term, what's the short term game, all of those questions with not a lot of answers. The following week I started working at the Women's March, and I didn't realize then that directing and producing films is actually a great foundation for organizing. It's all the same. It's all the same. So like I got thrown into it and organizing every day, 10, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I haven't really gotten back to my artistic roots since November 8th because I have been caught in this whirlwind of how to keep my community safe, how to keep this country safe, how to fight back as best we can. And yet, about 2 weeks ago, I felt I began to miss that creative energy, that creative need to write, that desire to create. And so one of my dear friends now from the Women's March, who's here tonight, Sarah Sophie, we sat down and we started thinking about this concept of creative resistance. What does creative resistance look like? Again, a lot of questions, not necessarily answers, a lot of ideas, but to go back to this place that to create is to have hope. To create is to create art is to be alive. To create art is to be a revolutionary. To create is spectacular and needed. And so very soon I will be delving back into that art. And there's books to be written, and there's movies to be made, and there's TV shows to be seen and made, but all with the idea of what I was talking about earlier, shifting hearts and minds, and also inspiring. You know, I was critiquing a lot this idea that my artwork was always just preaching to the choir. It was just preaching to the choir, preaching to the converted, like it's failed, it doesn't mean anything, like who listens? Only the people that already care about the issue. And one night, at like 10 o'clock at night, we were in Mr. Belafonte's offices, and Mr. B came, and he sat down, and that was a very special, incredible moment, and we were talking about this idea of artists. And his mentor, who is a man I respected and read about, and I have used his quote nonstop, was Paul Robeson, and he said that artists are the gatekeepers of truth. We are civilization's most radical voices. And that has been what I, as an artist, have tried to live my life by, that idea. And I was complaining to Mr. B about this concept of having preached to the choir, and it was pointless. And he said, you know what? The choir has to stay inspired, so you can preach to them. And that was a huge moment of, you are so fucking right. We do need that. So also in the art of the creation of making art to change and to get into someone else's heart, I also want to continue to create art to inspire us when we're tired, when we want to just sit down and we want to cry and we want to give up. And so that is what I'll be focusing on.
If you're interested in that, I would point you to the reproductive justice movement.
Yes.
So, which gets beyond the framework of choice, a framework I've never found very useful. I think it was Linda's point about the pro-life language that was adopted by the anti-abortion activists in the 1970s and 80s. Was really damaging. I don't think that the politics of choice and the language of choice has ever been particularly truthful about what's even available to lots of women. And so the reproductive justice movement, which focuses on all kinds of inequality in women who don't have choices, and how questions of reproduction aren't simply, it includes access and affordability of abortion services and ability to get birth control, but also interest in raising wages and criminal justice reform and access to good health care and quality jobs and affordable child care. Reproductive justice sees, with a particular eye to women of color and to poor women, sees the issue of reproductive rights as going well beyond questions of abortion and birth control, and that is a very active movement today. And so that's a good place to look for those kinds of questions.
I just want to add one sentence about the reproductive justice movement. I was recently on a panel with the head of Planned Parenthood in Washington, D.C., and Planned Parenthood has come a long way. And one of the things that she said is reproductive justice means being able to have a black son and not being afraid constantly that he's going to be shot down.
I spent most of my day yesterday at the place where they invented the term reproductive justice. That's the Mother House in Atlanta, that sister song that was founded by Loretta Ross, who invented the term reproductive justice. And so I hung out with Miss Loretta yesterday and Monica Ray Simpson, who now runs Sister Song Reproductive Justice Collective, and Loretta Ross and Ricky Solinger have a new book called Introduction to Reproductive Justice. And I also heard a tinge in there around doula care. I was like, that's the thing. I hear you saying that. So I think that that's a huge. So yes. So the right to doula care, the right to not have birth work overly medicalized, right? Which is also so for sure. So, but I learned that by, I learned that as part of my own sort of training in feminist thought, though. And even just finished. Am currently working with a master's student who does doula care, is working on this framework of healing justice, and is part of this Doulas of Color collective, and doing really cool work. And that's what she's working on for a master's thesis for me. I don't actually know what the answer is. I mean, I started together with some other ladies in 2010 a blog called the Crunk Feminist Collective blog. And just to give you an example of the kind of reach of that blog, a good friend of mine, Jamia Wilson, recently did a cover story with Solange Knowles, Beyonce's sister. And she talked about the fact that she's a high school educated woman. Those are her words. She didn't get to go to college. And so one of the things she said was, the way that I learned my feminism is from blogs like Crunk Feminist Collective, right? So to me, that's the reach, right? You don't get a Beyonce the feminist without feminism on social media, without feminism on YouTube. You don't get young people who can use the term intersectionality and who are thinking robustly about issues of consent and rape culture and all of those things without the kind of democratizing work that young feminists, both white and of color, have used through blogging to actually change the conversation. And so in fact, I don't think that you have this movement moment around any issue without social media, whether you're talking about Occupy or Black Lives Matter or the Women's March. It's all related to the ability of people to get information in the ways that they do. So no, do I think signing a petition is everything? I don't. But do I think that it matters that folks can feel like they did a little something to help the revolution today? Yes, I do. Because we think of social movements, we have the wrong idea about social movements. At the height of the civil rights movement, the liberal estimate is that 10% of Black people participated. That's the liberal estimate. Much less than 10% of Black people did civil rights work in this country. Every other Black person was like going to work and raising their kids. And so this idea that we need millions of people to be woke in order for something to change is actually not true. You need a committed, powerful few. That's always what does the work. And so I don't expect lots of participation. It's hard for people to get access, to have time, to be able to do the multiple day shifts that you do to do the work. And so I think that social media has given us far more good in terms of social activism than it's taken away from us. It's given us the ability to, like, the thing I remember is in 2012 when Trayvon Martin got killed, I heard about a protest in Union Square one day, and it happened the next day. And that was young Black folks showing us the power of social media activism to activate people. And today we heard a story of a 15-year-old kid named Jordan, I cannot think of his last name, who cops shot him. He was trying to leave a party where they were shooting. A cop pulled on the scene and just shot into him and his brother's car and killed him. And so I know about that because I'm on Facebook, right? And so part of our look, I actually think that one of the reasons many people are so anxious and stressed out is because we're hyper aware of all the bad shit. And I think that that's a function of social media, right? I don't know what we say about that because I do think we're on information overload. And that says to me that social media is having an impact on how we see the world. And then what I think we have to do is some other kind of work around how to filter, how to reorganize our lives to take in what matters most, but also to give ourselves permission that you don't have to fight every single battle, right? Because if you think you have to do everything, then typically what it means is that you do nothing because it's overwhelming. And so you have to pick the couple of things you can do and do those things, and then trust that other people will do the rest. So I'm typically pro social media. That doesn't mean I don't think it has some bad parts. People will talk real sideways to you, and I have a temper, and I don't like it when people think that the PhD means I won't clap back at them. And so it does bring out the worst in us sometimes too. Yeah.
So what happened last week is that the DNC decided to support this candidate, Heath Mello, who is a candidate for mayor in Omaha. He is in a long line of, we're assured, very progressive Democrats who happens to not only oppose reproductive rights, but as a state senator in Nebraska, have actually supported a 20-week ban, voted against telemedicine, which is really key to being able to have abortion services, especially in states where there are these bans. And there's very controversial language in this bill, but certainly have supported, and to some measure, an ultrasound bill that. Yeah, and the language in it, Jody Jacobson at Rewire wrote a really comprehensive piece about the legal language of this ultrasound bill, because it, on the one hand, sort of says, oh no, it's a voluntary ultrasound. It's just that doctors will have to offer an ultrasound, but in the same bill also says we'll need to determine the gestational age, which usually means a mandatory ultrasound. So it's sort of, there's been a lot of defense of this guy saying, no, but he tried to make the bill better by making it a voluntary ultrasound. It's very complicated. He signed a bad bill. He co-sponsored bad bills. He did work as a state senator in Nebraska to make Nebraska one of the hardest states in which to get an abortion, okay? And now he's running for mayor of Omaha. And when Tom Perez and Bernie Sanders were doing their extremely awkward unity tour last week, they were, doing their road show, and they were going to an event for Heath Mello. Now, the thing that was bad here, first of all, Bernie did say a specific thing. He was sort of ambivalent about Jon Ossoff, the candidate in Georgia's 6th district, and said he wasn't sure. He said, not all Democrats are progressives. I want to support progressives. I'm not sure if Jon Ossoff is progressive. He later sent out after there was a firestorm, he later sent out a very supportive message saying he's behind Jon Ossoff. But his first impulse was Jon Ossoff isn't progressive enough. Then he was asked, so you're going out to campaign for Heath Mello? And he said, well, this fellow in Nebraska, if he can win, that sends a real message that we can elect a progressive candidate. So that definition of progressivism did not include a commitment to supporting reproductive rights. Now, the problem here, there's a long history of this in the Democratic Party, which is exactly the problem. When pushed, both Bernie and Tom Perez, who were out on this unity tour to lead the Democrats into their bright progressive future, initially doubled down and said, as if they had just invented this idea, no, in order to get voters in red states, we should really think about this strategy. We could reach them on other issues. And this is, Bernie has been saying some stuff about this, saying, okay, so we might disagree on what he calls social issues or cultural issues like abortion or guns, but we can reach them on economic issues. Economic issues and reproductive rights are the same. There is no economic progressivism without reproductive autonomy. But the thing that was really bad about this is not about Heath Mello. On the one hand, I care very much. If I lived in Omaha, I would vote for Heath Mello, as I have voted for anti-choice Democrats my entire life, because I have always been held hostage by the Democratic Party, which is always telling me that they have a brilliant new strategy to elect more Democrats, which is that if we can just get some great progressive Democrats who don't believe in women's reproductive autonomy, then we can have all the power we want. And no women will be hurt in this process until you hit the Stupak-Pitts Amendment in the middle of healthcare reform, where it turns out that healthcare reform is supposed to benefit everybody except women who can't have access with this new reformed healthcare to their abortion care. So It is not about Heath Mello. It is about what we are now in a moment where we have this promise that we can have a new, more progressive future. And in part, this is brought to us by Bernie, who's so left-wing. In part, it is brought to us by Tom Perez, who's left. Look, I wanted him to be Hillary's running mate. These are the left guys. And they're suggesting this strategy that honestly has been deployed forever. This is Tim Kaine, this is Joe Biden, this is the history of these guys, not all guys, some women too, in the Democratic Party, who Joe Biden, voted for the Hyde Amendment in versions that did not include exceptions for the life and health of the mother. Okay, there are really strong, Bob Casey's, who I grew up with in Pennsylvania, really strongly anti-abortion Democrats have been a fact of life in this party for a long time. And they were most recently promoted by none other than Rahm Emanuel in 2016 when he ran the DCCC and decided we could get a House if we could just run anti-choice Democrats. So my problem with what happened last week regarding Heath Mello was not Heath Mello. It was the fact that the new leadership that's telling us that we have a new higher progressive bar that we have to reach is actually just trying to sell as their own new brilliant idea, a strategy that women a strategy that has been forced on women over and over and over again. And it sucks because women and people of color women of color, families of color, who are most profoundly affected by restrictions on abortion and on reproductive autonomy are the base of the Democratic Party, and they don't have anywhere else to go, and that is fundamentally why they do this. Because they know, what are we going to do, vote for Republicans? And so they screw over their base again and again because they know they have us. And they don't even have to. New polling, it used to be, but we'd get so many more people to vote for Democratic candidates if we just, opposed abortion. All contemporary polling tells us that basic support for Roe is at 70% even in red states. We do not have to trade this shit out. It is actually one of the more popular positions of the Democratic Party. There is literally no reason. Okay, you're in Omaha, you got one, right, this happens. It's not about Omaha, it's not about Heath Mello. It's about proposing it as a strategy going forward, and that's what happened last week. And I am very pleased that there was a pushback that produced from Tom Perez a very apologetic, it was too, too little too late, but it did show that there was nobody to oppose Rahm Emanuel when he proposed this in 2006. The women's voices electorally and in terms of activism weren't loud enough at that point to get them to reconsider. And last week there was enough of a shitstorm, and it was ugly on both sides. I have a lot of progressive people who are really angry at me because I was critical of Bernie Sanders, even though I was also critical of Tom Perez and the DNC. It's not easy, but there was enough of a pushback that at least there was a really robust discussion. And in the New York Times, there's an editorial that points out, and it should be obvious, but it's not, reproductive rights are economic issues. And that wound up in the Times. So I do think we're at a point where at least the pushback is louder.
Let me also say, Bernie Sanders is a white man. And why is everyone so shocked that as soon as he didn't get elected, he went back to parroting every single regular old white male position? Well, white people it wasn't really racism, it's just class anxiety. What the hell are you talking about? That's not true. That's not true. That is the version that you as a white man want it to be because you want to see and are invested in the notion that white people are benevolent, right? And that they don't really want to harm people, they just want to be okay. Because he's never talking about black class anxiety. Think about it. Who has real class anxiety in this country? People that don't have any wealth, people who have had wage stagnation forever, people who've seen the wealth gap decreasing since 1984, right? And then people who saw half of all black net wealth went away after 2008. After half. And we have that much to begin with. And he's not talking about black women's class anxiety around the fact that black women my age have a total net wealth of $5 on average. I'm not exaggerating. That's the statistics. Black women between the ages of 36 and 49 have an average or median net wealth of $5. He's not talking about our class anxiety. He wants to redeem white people by using class as a narrative of white redemption, and we should reject that, right? And so time is out for any white men who want to have a class analysis without a gender analysis and a race analysis. And I saw so many sort of really liberal white people, some of whom I really like, saying that, oh no, because Bernie said, and this is something that my grandmother, knowing who my great-grandmother and my grandmother were, both women that I got to know, my revolution will never look like anything a white man is bringing. Once I stopped rejecting white Jesus, then I was like, this is interesting. Y'all so woke, everybody's so woke, but it turns out that even though y'all hate Jesus, right? White Jew Jesus, you love white Jew. This is very interesting. And, it's real interesting to me that you so when as a Christian, as a church girl, when I rejected the notion that Jesus was a white man, then I also rejected the notion of white saviors come to do anything. And so look, that might be a crass notion of identity politics, except for that it turns out that when people show you who they are, believe them. And so Bernie Sanders has shown us who he was. He was an unreconstructed socialist when he started. He's an unreconstructed socialist today. And the thing that makes me mad about Bernie, and the reason I'm speaking so unequivocally, is not because I think Hillary Clinton is a savior, although I think she would have been a great president. It's because the only thing that got Bernie Sanders to even play like he cared about black people was black girls running up on him on stage and forcing him to have a race analysis. And so part of the reason I don't fuck with him, right, is because he was going to try to use the labor of chicks who looked like me to get in the office, and then as soon as he lost, then he abandoned us, right? And so he's not anybody we can trust, which means he's just like every other politician, and it means he wants to build a world in which white people have security about money, but no one else does, and that's not revolutionary.
We owe so much to activist lawyering and their incredible creativity and imagination about how to use the law against the master. So, I can't talk about the elected representatives, but about people who are doing what you're kind of doing, I am just in awe and feel tremendous gratitude.
I think maybe sometimes we flatten out what Audre Lorde was trying to tell us, in the sense that you can't use the master's tools the master's way to dismantle the master's house. But the great thing about folks who are radical and revolutionary is that we use the tools differently because we see a different aim and end for them. And so I don't think that you have to be caught in this position where you feel like, the Scylla and Charybdis, you're trying, you know what I mean? I don't think it has to be that kind of struggle. Because I think that, so one, I would say that, right? That imagine yourself to be using the tools to do a different kind of work. Imagine yourself to not see the tools in the same way. We don't use words in the same way. We don't think about, and I, in my work, think about, critical race theory and critical legal studies, and folks who see what the law is and see it for what it is and sort of imagine the kind of work that it can do and it can't do. And so I think it's just a creative shift that'll free you up from the feeling that you're just sort of reproducing the system. But I also believe that rights matter. And one of the things that I think about is I always follow the lead of black women. And when I look at the election, black women are deeply invested in this being a functioning structure. By and large, black women are not invested in a revolution that begins with destruction. Because that's the other thing too, is that I think we have this idea that revolutions are about tearing everything down. And one of the things that I'm really trying to think through in my own work, particularly because I'm with young black activists a lot who kind of want to flirt with revolutionary violence, but they all middle class, so they don't really want to flirt with it. Not really. And those of us who come from working class backgrounds know when we see middle class folks who are, spouting all this shit, because it's like if you've ever been around real actual violence, you're not rushing to go back to it. You're actually not, right? And so what I see marginalized communities wanting is a sense of safety, a sense of protection, and the ability to envision and dream. And I think that those are the questions that we have to ask when we think about what it means to build a revolution. And I'm just not so clear anymore that it looks like tearing down. And that doesn't mean that I don't think we need to tear down white supremacy or whatever. Of course I do. But I think that when we think about what that looks like institutionally, Trump's supporters have told us that white people believe in revolutions because what they're doing is breaking shit. All they're doing is tearing down every single thing that we thought that we stood for. The sort of, conflicts of interest in who they have appointed and the way that they have played willy-nilly and loose with their own, like the kind of shit you learn in social studies and political science about American democratic principles. None of these white boys are doing any of that. They are destroying their own sort of sense of American idealism and exceptionalism. So we know what a revolution rooted in tearing down and destroying looks like because we're witnessing it. That's why we all feel so crazy, right? Because revolutions can be destructive too. So I always think in a black feminist tradition about what can we build? What is the world we want to build? Because when I look at what black women do, they just look at structures and they literally start with what do people need? And how can we build it? And those are the questions that I would always come back to in the law. What do people need? And how can we build it, right? And thinking about that really multi-generationally, right? And trying to think 3 or 4 steps ahead. And so not flattening out Audre Lorde's position. She's trying to call out people who think they can get into the system, people who trying to play themselves, right? By thinking that they can have power and not be corrupted, by thinking that they can get into the system and not have a different kind of vision of what you do there. But look, all of us who work in institutions, we can still be oppositional within institutions. Yes, we can. I believe that we can, because I'm tired of us telling marginalized folks that the revolution looks like them having nothing, you know, them having crumbs, but that's the radical and woke position. I'm not going to tell folks who've suffered their whole lives that that's what revolution looks like. Because if I said that, I would be saying that to my grandmother and my mother and the people that I love, and that looks like suffering, and that's not revolutionary to me. So I would say, think about it in that way, that it's a creative use of the tools that are available to you to build a really different kind of world. And every time I see radical folks think in that way, then something different comes about.
I think there's always an interaction between social movements and electoral politics. I really like your point about how the problems didn't start with Trump. I think the Democratic Party has been almost bankrupt in terms of what it's been doing for a long time, certainly since Bill Clinton, or probably further back than that. But my impression, and I quote as my authority Francis Fox Piven, who I think is the person who's written the most importantly about this, is that elected representatives can only defy the incredible power of money and lobbyists if, on the other hand, they have really, really powerful social movements pushing the other way. And so, I said before, I'm delighted to see a lot of women running for office. I do think that at the state and local levels, there's quite a lot of space, even in the so-called red states. But I think that will only work if these large mobilizations continue and create pressure.
If I can add to that really quickly, I recently interviewed Kirsten Gillibrand. I did a profile of her for New York Magazine, and she spoke. So I've always been to the left of the Democratic Party, right? In my lifetime, I have been dismayed by the Democratic Party, and I've been to the left of everybody I've ever voted for, everybody, right? And I, in many ways, had given up hope up until, even into the Obama administration about the possibility of a mass move to the left. And for this, though I was not a Bernie person, I'm really grateful to Bernie, in part because what we just saw happen, I actually think was very hopeful. It didn't work, but one of the things, and this also speaks to dismantling the master's house with the master's tools. So you take 2 issues that are really important to me, raising the minimum wage and paid family leave, right? And both Bernie and Hillary, forget it, they did not bring those issues in. It was state and local activism over the course of decades in places like New York, Seattle, in California, where you got people who labored in these little, and everybody now sort of makes fun of the tactical, or doesn't think, I guess, the tactical sort of chipping away at stuff isn't sufficiently revolutionary. But this, to me, is an example of how you get it done. Activists working on minimum wage reform and on paid leave reform. And those things were third rail issues. Paid leave? I've been writing about feminist politics for 15 years, and up until 5 minutes ago, that was a toxic subject, but it starts working, and states start passing it, and it works well, and more states and cities start passing it. And it's not that either Bernie or Hillary, as the elected officials, were at the head of either of those fights, really. At all. And, Hillary was saying it can't be done. As somebody who cared a lot about paid leave policy throughout her career, she said in 2014, I don't think we're ready to do it yet. She didn't think we'd caught up because it was so third rail. But it was happening in states and cities. And then the next thing you know, Barack Obama's talking about it in the State of the Union. I thought, in 2014, he said paid leave, mandatory paid leave legislation. I thought I was going to fall off the couch. I was like, dear Penthouse Forum, I can't believe it happened to me. Like, I can't, to think that I would hear at a State of the Union, a president calling for paid leave reform, it was a dream come true. That had come through these activist groups and up to the elected politicians who felt the surge of the movement behind them. And then you had Bernie bringing the Fight for 15 and some of that assuredness about the power of those movements and those people. And then it had an impact on Hillary Clinton's candidacy, so that she moved left. She felt, and Hillary, has always not necessarily felt the assuredness that she would have support behind her for left positions, and has thus, gone center and right sometimes. But suddenly there was the affirmation that there was a movement that could support more left-leaning positions. You had Kirsten Gillibrand making the Family Act, Barbara Lee supporting the Each Woman Act, coming up with which opposes Hyde, and suddenly you had a presidential candidate, a Democrat, who was running against Hyde for mandatory paid leave, for a higher minimum wage. That was her platform going into November, and she almost won, right? We forget that. So, and what Gillibrand said to me post-election in February, and she was like, this shit is working. And she actually did say that. The calls, she said, do not, because I said to her, you just sound like my aunt on Facebook, like, keep the calls and letters coming. Like, she's like, no, for real, I'm a senator. People care. People care. The fact that people are calling every day, everybody in Congress gets their log of how many people call and send their letters. And tell your friends on Facebook. People are listening. This is why healthcare didn't get repealed. This is why so far Planned Parenthood hasn't been defunded, which is shocking. They could have done that the first day, except they were busy cleaning up after the Women's March. But that's the point. That's the point. And so don't look to the elected officials to be the saviors. I think it is. We've just seen a laboratory where we can see where the movement, and unfortunately the unsexy part, which is the grinding day-to-day incrementalism that Hillary wound up being tagged as, could combine with the sort of mass revolutionary spirit that Bernie was credited with transmitting to work to actually change a Democratic platform. This was the most progressive Democratic platform of my lifetime, and I guess by many standards in history. And we're still hearing about how it was pretty much the same as Donald Trump, and that she was practically a Republican. It was the most progressive platform of our lifetime. That just happened, and it came really close to succeeding.
One of the things we have to think about is the class analysis that goes on among the Trump people. And the class analysis is that, I can't speak for you in the audience, but it's people like me that are the problem. Elite, urban, intellectuals, professionals, artists, writers, all that stuff. That is a wrong class analysis. But it is a response to a sense that they have that we disdain them. And that has happened over and over again in American history. Disagreement, anger, rage is different. Disdain is, I think, a toxic premise on which to build any political movement. So, I definitely don't advocate anybody wasting their time trying to reason with people. But it's different about talking about them on the basis of the issues and not on the basis of their stupidity, et cetera, et cetera.
One thing that I like to push back on is this idea that we live in a bubble. Because we don't live in the bubble. We are the majority, right? Like, that is the reality. They live in the bubble. If it's going to be a you or they are the ones that are living in the bubble. They are the minority, and that minority is shrinking drastically. So I think it's really important that we actually change that mentality and push back on that myth, because that myth disempowers us when in reality we really truly do hold the power. That's first and foremost. Secondly, while I agree that one should not waste their time on hateful, racist people that there's just no talking to. I do think that it is your responsibility as a white woman to talk to white people.
Yes.
Like I can't continue to have that conversation with white people because it is exhausting, because I'm constantly teaching, because I've already been traumatized by 10,000 things that have happened to me in just 2 weeks. So it is your responsibility to talk to your uncle, and it's for you to define if he's a rational person to talk to, but even to talk to your neighbor, because I do think that in the talking, that's that one-on-one connection to get into the heart, and maybe a seed can be planted that can grow into something else. And so I think that is where your power lies, and that's where we need you to do that work, is to talk to the people that we are just too exhausted to talk to.
Yeah, Rebecca and I were talking about this when we were together the other day. The one thing that I would say to you that was really hard for me about this election is that white women don't have the sense that y'all need to get your people. Like, get your girls, get them, gather them together. And what I mean by that is, as a black feminist, look, I come from evangelical Christian people from the Deep South. So I also grew up around the very kind of white people that we typically stereotype up north, right? Jesus-loving Republicans who carry Confederate flags. I mean, that's my hometown. And what I will say about that is that in my own family and in my own community, I feel like it's my responsibility to get my people. I'm a feminist among people who are not necessarily feminist, and I try to slide in little feminist ideas every time I can, you know, because I think feminism can save lives, right? So that's why I do it as a love practice. And then, but when you see it as a love practice, which is the thing you talked about earlier, then you don't shout at people, right? So I'm not telling you to go home and pick fights with people. Right? I'm telling you that, like, I don't go home and try to preach to my people about how they need to change everything that they think. Sometimes I just tell them what I think, right? Sometimes I just, because my mama, like, is the first feminist I knew, but she wouldn't identify as that. And so, you know, I would just be over here doing what I do. And one day she was like, I think I am a crunk feminist. I was like, of course, right? But, you know, but I didn't go home and say, you need to be this, you need to change this, whatever. So it's about learning the art of how to talk to your people in a loving way that does see them, right? I reserve the right, however, to disdain everyone who, you know, votes for people who literally would rather see my folks die than thrive, right? So I'm sorry, but I have disdain for most folks who vote for the GOP. I reserve the right to that disdain, because telling me that I don't have the right to it suggests that what I am fundamentally supposed to do is always be trying to see the humanity of people who are deeply invested structurally in denying my own humanity, right? So I'm not doing it. But I also would, you know, just say to you too that, like, it's really important in this moment as well. Like, I'm like cool with white feminist chicks to a certain extent, but I wonder why y'all feel like feminism is an individualist project. Like, self-transformation is important, but I actually care less about self-transformation than what community transformation looks like. It's why I spend a lot of time as a black feminist talking to black men, and please know that they're terrible many times. They really are. Like, you know, individual ones notwithstanding, in the aggregate, they don't ride for black women, and 13% of black men voted for Trump, and folks are like, I'm so shocked. And I was like, nope, because there are plenty of narcissistic, megalomaniacal black men who talk that way to black women all the time, who are terrible mansplainers and sexual assaulters. And so, of course, they resonated with him. They want the kind of power that he has. It makes total sense to me. What I'm shocked by is that more of them didn't vote for him, right? And so, but I still talk to them and organize for them because I love them even when they don't love me. And so I feel like black women and women of color, we always have to exist in the tension of trying to talk to people that we know don't think like us, don't love us, and don't ride for us, but we don't have the ability to, but we won't get free with an individualist narrative. But the thing that white people have to learn is, one, that y'all are a part of a group, that group is called white people, and two, that you won't get free if your people don't get it either.
All right, I have been told that I have to cut it off. It's over. Thank you guys so much.